Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Our next panel will be focused on how to integrate community health and forest management and the importance of combining those two conversations. So to get us started off, I will turn it over to Dr. Claire Schollaert. And Claire, take it away.
All right, thanks, Lauren. Again, my name's Claire Schollaert, and I'm a researcher at UCLA, the School of Public Health, though I currently reside in Seattle. I'm an environmental health scientist, and within that, I particularly focus on exposure assessment. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about ways that we can measure and quantify how and to what extent communities are exposed to various environmental contaminants. And within that, I'm mostly focused on air pollution and wildfire smoke, which is the reason I'm sitting on this panel today. And, from a public health perspective, what we're most concerned about when we think about wildfire beyond the obvious, physical threat to life and property that the flames pose themselves, when we think about smoke, we're really worried about, the respiratory outcomes. We know that smoke exposure can contribute to asthma exacerbation as well as COPD, cardiovascular disease. There's also some emerging work linking exposure to birth outcomes like low birth weight and preterm birth if the mother is exposed during pregnancy. As well as some emerging work on the relationship between smoke exposure and adverse mental health outcomes. So given this obvious public health problem, in addition to the broader societal and ecological impacts of our worsening wildfire crisis, we are all sort of desperately searching for solutions. And we know that one of the most effective tools that we have to mitigate extreme wildfire risk is the use of prescribed burning. So my work is really focused on quantifying smoke exposure trade-offs of wildfire and different forest management strategies, and particularly how those trade-offs play out amongst vulnerable populations, like outdoor agricultural workers, for example. So my work thinking about this trade-off has sort of spanned spatial scales from the more local landscape level work, where we've partnered with forest managers and ecologists who've developed a set of specific management options for an experimental landscape in the Central Sierra around Lake Tahoe. And we were tasked with, modeling and simulating what the air quality and public health outcomes might look like if any of those forest management scenarios were implemented on that specific landscape, so that a group of managers could incorporate those sorts of data points into their decision-making processes. And my current work is sort of scaling some of that up as something we're calling the Western Fire and Forest Resilience Collaborative, which is led by the Carroll Institute of Ecosystem Science and funded by the Moore Foundation. We're an interdisciplinary group of researchers from institutions across the Western states working together to better understand mechanisms of forest resilience, coming up with better ways to track forest and fire, coming up with novel and innovative ways to simulate and model the impacts of climate change and different management options on ecosystem processes and fire risk, and then taking those model outputs and figuring out how to simulate downstream impacts on things like air quality, water quality, biodiversity, wild and urban interface impacts at a full Western US scale. So while I certainly represent the public health perspective in this conversation, my work is really wholly dependent on collaboration with forest ecologists and forest managers, which is really the type of collaboration and coordination that I think is going to be really central to the conversation we're hoping to have today. And so I do sit more on the research side of things, but I'm really excited to hear from the perspectives of my fellow panelists who sort of represent the more policy and practitioner side of this conversation. And I'm excited for us to work through how to optimize strategies for reducing wildfire risk while also prioritizing promoting community resilience and protecting the health of vulnerable communities. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to my fellow panelists to introduce themselves, and then we can get this started.
I don't think it works. Well, Hi, I'm Yulia Carroll, and I'm the Associate Director for Science at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Division for Environmental Health Science and Practice. It's a lot of words, but we are basically the division at CDC that deals with all issues related to environmental health, and wildfires are under our climate health portfolio. At CDC, what our focus is on public health, both community health and workers' health, like firefighters. So our work is, and I'm so glad to be here because we actually work with so many or almost all of the federal agencies that deal with wildfires, and also with academia, state and local health departments. But really our role of reaching and protecting public health is to work and support the states, the local health departments, the state health departments, and also the tribal and territorial. And we do this just by the usual grants process, which, like we heard about it yesterday. We have dedicated capacity management or building capacity and climate-ready states, cities, and tribes programs. We also have a dedicated funding for emergency response preparedness and recovery. And so this is something that I should have probably said, that we manage all aspects of wildfire, from preparedness, prevention during the wildfire event, and then recovery and response. So, of course, we also look at the health effects, and we do this together with the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences and EPA. And our work on health effects is really focused on being more regional and what the health effects for different populations in different areas are, and also how to prepare the messaging for them. So just some examples: we're recently updating our public guidance on preparation for and response to wildfire smoke. And we continue to provide guidance to the Wildfire Smoke Guide to public health officials. So as I said, our NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, which is part of CDC, is also working on the use of respirators for both workers and general public health, ventilation, and clean and high efficiency filters. So all of those issues, again, to prepare and prevent. So a big part of our work is to make all of the information that is in the space from all of the federal agencies being usable and actionable, so meaningful. And the way that we do it, we have a dashboard where anyone can put their zip code, and they can pull information on just for the wildfires, the current real-time wildfire smoke levels, also historical levels, and projected. And this is something that NOAA and the National Weather Service there provided for us, but we pull a lot of exposure information on various environmental, and also we provide social vulnerability information and health information like hospitalizations and emergency department visits. So anyone can go and pull information. This is both for the public, but also for healthcare professionals, for the local health departments to be prepared. There is information for public, but also for the animals and their health, including livestock and shelters, and all information related to before, during, and after. And finally, because we cannot provide grants to everyone, we do provide a lot of technical assistance, and this can be anything that the state requests in the health arena, from health impact assessments, exposure assessments, communication. That's actually a big part of our portfolio of communication that is specifically appropriate for the local communities, and it is different from community to community. And we have assisted many of the Western states like California, Oregon. We're still in Hawaii helping with their wildfires, and we provide a lot of health alerts and information for healthcare providers. So that's all for me. Thank you.
All right. Hey, good morning. My name is Tom Torres, and I'm the state forester in Arizona. And by statute, I have jurisdictional responsibility for managing about 22 million acres in Arizona. Arizona in total is about 71 million acres, so that's a pretty big job. And just so you know, all the Western states, almost all of the states in the United States have a counterpart. We all have state foresters who have similar responsibilities to manage both wildfire mitigation, forest health, and fight wildfire. And so I have a couple of maps behind me on the screen. I just want to get us grounded in the situation in Arizona. You know, I'm one of those people who is on sort of on the practitioner side. I'm the person who helps coordinate with the federal management agencies and others, local governments, county governments, to actually implement projects on the ground to mitigate fire and again, to fight wildfire. And so I have a couple of maps. The one is the jurisdiction map, shows the broad variety of jurisdictions in the state of Arizona. There's a lot of different colors on there that represents a lot of different jurisdictions. My responsibilities are largely the blue areas on the map. Those are state trust lands. And the white areas on the map, those are private property, unincorporated. The other colors on the map, the green is the U.S. Forest Service. There's about 11 million acres in Arizona in the 6 national forests. And the sort of the orange color is the tribal nations in Arizona. There are 22 distinct tribal nations in Arizona. And there's some military lands, state parks, national parks, et cetera. So it's complicated. That's my point here. And the map on the right is the risk map, and that represents, this shows modeled risk of exposure to significant wildfire across the state of Arizona. And as you can see, the dark red represents the most exposure, i.e. the most risk. And if you sort of compare the two maps, you'll notice that a lot of the risk is on the federal estate, i.e. the U.S. Forest Service. That's why when Undersecretary Wilkes was up here talking, the wildfire crisis strategy is really being led by the national or by the U.S. Forest Service, because that's where a lot of risk exists in Arizona. And that's where a lot of risk exists in the other Western states across the country. And so, as we heard this morning, wildfire does not respect jurisdictional boundaries, and neither does the need for landscape level forest restoration. Like all Western states, Arizona landscapes include important watersheds that are at risk of catastrophic fire, and hence the need for restoration. Arizona has, like other Western states, has seen its fair share of catastrophic wildfire. Going all the way back to the year 2000, well over 3.5 million acres in those high-risk areas shown on the map have burned. Back in 2000, the Wallow Fire burned over the Rodeo Chetasky was in 2002, and that burned about 460,000 acres. At the time, that was a very extreme wildfire in Arizona. In 2011, the Wallow Fire burned about 538,000 acres, and more recently in 2021, the Telegraph and Mescal Fire burned over 200,000 acres in Gila County primarily. The fires are larger, they're more destructive, and hence the need for wildfire mitigation projects at greater pace and scale. Many projects are directly aimed at reducing vegetation. Vegetation is the fuel that drives these wildfire, and it gets aligned with wind and other climatic conditions, and we're off to the races. The projects involve reducing vegetation by logging, thinning, mechanical removal, known as mastication. Some of you may have heard that term, and burning. Prescribed fire is an important part of the tools in our toolbox to address the wildfire crisis across the Western United States. As a result, the desired conditions of our forests is to have fire play its natural ecological role on the landscape. For a long time, upwards over 100 years, fire has been excluded from the landscape, and it's largely led to the conditions we have now. And so, our excessive fuel conditions, coupled with increased temperature in our weather, increased development, housing, and other built infrastructure continues to happen in Arizona, just like across the other states in the western part of the country, make this a huge undertaking with many challenges. Smoke management is but one of those challenges. So I'll stop there, turn it over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning. My name is John Martin. I am director of the Native American Forestry Program at the Ecological Restoration Institute at Northern Arizona University. And I've been there about 5 years now. Before that, I worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs as a forester and the Navajo Nation. And in that role, I had the opportunity to work with most of the tribes in the Southwest. And as part of that, I worked a lot with federal agencies on various natural resource management issues. So what I want to talk about today are three things. One is to introduce you to the Ecological Restoration Institute at NAU. I also want to go quickly through legislative actions that are significant to federal and tribal forest management. And then I want to give you a couple examples of success here in Arizona that we are seeing as a consequence of these legislative actions. Is there a clicker? Okay. Okay, so the Ecological Restoration Institute was established in 2004 by an act of Congress, the Southwest Forest Health and Wildfire Prevention Act. That act also established institutes at Colorado and New Mexico. So for those folks here from Colorado and New Mexico, there is a similar institute that is available to you. And collectively, we are known as the Southwest Ecological Restoration Institutes. Below that, you can see our mission, which is to demonstrate and promote the use of adaptive management to reduce the risk of wildfires and restore the health of fire-adapted forests and woodland ecosystems of the interior West. Now, that's a big mission. That's a lot to accomplish. So how do we do this? Well, the institutes develop relevant knowledge and deliver the best available restoration science to communities, stakeholders, land managers to support actionable decisions. And this mission is included in our charter. Oh, how do I go forward? Okay, so very quickly, I would like to present to you 4 significant legislative actions that have a very strong influence on tribal and federal land and forest management. The first is the Indian Self-Determination Act, passed in 1975. And this basically established a process for tribes to contract federal functions. Some of you have maybe heard the term 638 contract. This is where the term comes from. The second piece of legislation is the National Indian Forest Resources Management Act, which was passed in 1990. And this basically codified how tribal forests will be managed. And it required development of a management plan, the use of sustained yield, and it also identified funding to support tribal forest management programs. The next act I would like to share with you is the Tribal Forest Protection Act, commonly known as TFPA. This was passed in 2004, and this act basically authorized tribes to propose projects on adjacent federal land in order to protect tribal resources that may have been threatened from disease and in particular wildland fire from adjacent federal lands. And this was in response to the Rodeo Chetiskyi fire that Tom mentioned. And then the last piece of legislation that I'd like to mention is the 2018 Farm Bill, which extended good neighbor authority to the tribes. In the past, or before this, the 2018 Farm Bill, good neighbor authority had been extended to the states. The 2018 Farm Bill extended that to tribes. So why is this important? We've heard a lot of talk about the San Carlos Apache priority landscape, and there's a map of the proposed activities. So what are the expected outcomes of this big effort? This is a priority landscape. I have there in red some of the outcomes that I would like to emphasize. Primarily, it's an effort to reduce wildfire exposure to the communities. It's also an effort to reintroduce wildland fire into fire-adapted ecosystems in a culturally sensitive way. The next point is to foster public understanding and sharing of culturally significant information to better guide our land management decisions. And there's a goal there. We expect to complete 87,000 acres of treatments between fiscal years 2003 and 2027. And I'd like to focus a little bit on that bottom paragraph there, because what that says there is that the first 2 years of this effort will be focused on increasing the San Carlos Apache tribe's capacity to meet, support, and reach Forest Service goals for shared stewardship. The other example of success that I would like to present is an effort that I've been involved with called Wood for Life, which is basically providing firewood to tribal communities on the Hopi and Navajo nations from forest restoration treatments on the Coconino and Kaibab National Forest. And this is once again in support of forest restoration and Forest Service goals of shared stewardship on the Coconino and Kaibab National Forest. And ERI, we were recognized by Chiefs Award for our support of this, and I'm told that that is one of the highest awards you can achieve in the Forest Service. So these are a couple examples of the effort required. There's a Hopi Ancestral Lands crew providing firewood, and in the bottom there you see a group of us collaborators out in the woods, scratching our heads about what are we going to do about these big log piles here that have come from forest restoration treatments. We have no other place to put this. So that is an example of the collaboration that is required to make this a success. And why is this important? This is a map similar to what Tom just shared. It shows tribal lands relative to all federal lands within Arizona and New Mexico, which are typically referred to as Region 3 in the Forest Service. But keep in mind, there's 33 tribes within that landscape, and there's also 3 BIA regions that have responsibility for natural resource management on all tribal lands in that area. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you. It's good information. I'm Woody Cline. I'm with Gila County. I'm a district supervisor on the board there in Gila County, District 3. My district runs up the east side of Gila County, all the way from Winkleman plumb to the top of the rim north of Payson. I've been with Gila County since 2016, and in that time, we've dealt with many issues when it comes to natural resources. Gila County is 97% public lands, meaning there's only about 3% private lands in Gila County. So virtually everything that goes on basically in Gila County is one agency or another, whether it's BLM, Forest Service, state, whoever it is, tribal. We overlap the tribes on the east side. My district overlaps with San Carlos, White Mountain Apaches, and Tono Apaches in Payson. And so a lot of what we do is coordinating with either the tribes or other agencies on some of these larger projects or issues. Over the time I've been in supervisor, Gila County has had roughly 6 type 1 incidents as far as fires, the Telegraph fire being the latest one and Mescal fire. The advantage I've had dealing with these fires and helping Gila County on this is previously I spent 20 years in the Forest Service in fire management and range. And so it kind of put me in a different aspect of looking at this. You know, I came out of the government from the standpoint of working and dealing with these fires, and then you get that one knocked out of the way, you're off and gone to the next one. What I wasn't used to coming out of the Forest Service was the aftermath of these fires and what was actually put in your lap when the fire was over. And that was a huge learning curve for me. We dealt with a lot of flooding issues, a lot of infrastructure damaged issues, and so forth. And the other big part of that is when the fire's done, the smoke is clearing, the people are gone, and you're sitting there kind of looking around thinking, oh wow, And not only are the people gone, but so's the money to put back in there and help with those infrastructures and such. So I've had a really good learning curve on that side of the fence. Like I said, prior to that, I dealt with many fires from prescribed fire level to wildfire level. So I had all that down pat, but this other side of the fence was different for me. So it's been good. I really appreciate listening to what Jonathan and Tom had to say. There's a couple of things that came out of that. I can tell you that has been a huge benefit for the folks on the ground in these areas, especially these rural areas. One of them is the adaptive management part of it. That is huge. The other one is the Good Neighbor Authority. As Gila County, we deal with DIFM, which is Tom's agency and his department there. Big help. They do a lot of work with us. They help us on a lot of watershed projects and so forth. And that was a huge plus. So thank you both for that. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Claire.
Awesome. Thank you. So we have a set of questions we're going to work through, and then there'll be time for questions from the audience towards the end. And I want to kick us off by starting to think about the role of Indigenous burning practices in this conversation. We know that Indigenous peoples have long fostered healthy forests, and I'm curious about how traditional ecological knowledge has informed and shifted forest management practices across all levels of government to better reduce uncharacteristic wildfire risk. And maybe we start with John to expand on some of the comments he made in his opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Claire. And I wish you could tell me what TEK is. And as you know, there are 33 tribes in Arizona and New Mexico, and I imagine each tribe would have their own version or desires related to TEK. But what I can share with you is that there is an incredible amount of interest in integrating TEK into federal land management activities, insofar as that I have had inquiries from the Forest Service head of hazardous fuels saying, how do we integrate these practices into our burning activities, our management practices? This is a difficult question. And all that I've been able to discern in the couple of years that I've been looking at it is that cultural burning, which has become the focus of TEK in prescribed fire management, the only thing I've been able to discern is that they differ in size and season. And how appropriate is this to federal land management prescribed burning practices remains to be seen. The other difficulty of integrating TEK and cultural burning into federal land management activities is this issue of fire qualifications, NWCG requirements that tribes and tribal practitioners have a very difficult time achieving in order to pursue cultural burning on their traditional lands. So I think there's a lot to be learned. How do you integrate this into longstanding practices is a challenge, and I think we'll see more and more of it in the very near future.
Tom, do you have anything to add from the state level?
Sure. So building on what John said, I think, one of the hallmarks of utilizing traditional ecological knowledge is the application of wildfire or the application of fire. Fire is natural. The indigenous peoples before say early 1900s, late 1800s knew that regular application of wildfire on the landscape was important. And I think you see the adoption of that principle in all levels of land management, whether it's the national forest systems, whether it's the BLM or state government. I can tell you, I don't know if I mentioned this in my opening remarks, but I spent 35 years working for the U.S. Forest Service and the last 12 in Arizona, but I spent time in California, Oregon, Nevada, Colorado, almost all of them. So I spent a lot of time, and I can tell you that the application and the acceptance of prescribed fire on the landscape is one principle that's being broadly accepted across the West. The other thing that is important to notice is that in just, asking the tribal nations and especially the elders, what is important from a tribal perspective? Just asking that question is hugely important. One of the things that's happening in Arizona is identifying what species of plants, trees are important in order to help manage for their recovery, their sustainability, et cetera. Emery oak is an example of a species in Arizona that's highly valued by the Apache tribes, and it's in the preservation of those emery oak stands and that species is a principal thing to consider in the application of management practices across the state, including by state government. And so, there's a lot of work to be done, but I think there's room for hope in order to, when we think about the future, because I think relationships are stronger than they have been in the past. Jonathan mentioned the San Carlos Apache tribal landscape that's identified by the Forest Service as a priority landscape in the wildfire crisis strategy. I believe that is the largest tribal project in the Forest Service's portfolio of projects that address specifically tribal lands. Of that project includes about 2 million acres on the San Carlos Apache reservation. So there's room for being encouraged, but there's a lot of work more to do in the future.
Thank you, Claire. So in the course of time, one thing I didn't mention was I live in Young. And so we're neighbors with the White Mountain Apache tribe. They're right there. And so all my time in the government, fire management, I had a lot of dealings with the White Mountain Apaches on that side. I watched their management styles and learned a lot by that. And I was always envious. Those folks knew what they were doing back then. This would have been like in the late 90s, early 2000s. And the country that they were using these practices on was outstanding when it was done. And I thought long and hard about that through the course of time when I was in the Forest Service, wishing that we could do the same. But due to NEPA, National Environmental Protection Act, and other issues and loops and hurdles that we had to go through, in a lot of ways, our hands were tied. And the tribes back then knew exactly what they wanted. They knew what that land was supposed to look like, and they were able to make that happen. And I think today what I see happening with San Carlos, and hopefully this is going to continue on through the other tribes, I think that's just going to carry forth, and they'll continue on with their landscape practices. So it's really good.
Thank you. So we heard and we saw in Tom's opening remarks that this wildfire crisis is certainly a jurisdictional jigsaw puzzle. So I'm wondering, how can states, localities, and tribes effectively and meaningfully work together to mitigate, respond to, and recover from catastrophic wildfire? Maybe we start with Tom to kind of expand on what he's commenting on there.
Given the jurisdictional jigsaw puzzle, I like that, by the way, the need for collaboration, partnerships, and solidifying working relationships is huge. As you heard Governor Hobbs talk this morning and the Undersecretary, there's a lot of money being invested in this issue in Arizona and across the West. And the real challenge from my perspective is implementation. We used to talk in the Western states in Arizona that we didn't have enough lands covered by NEPA. Woody talked about NEPA. That's the environmental regulation that says you have to comply with a whole bunch of federal regulations around environmental protection largely, but also cultural issues as well. And we're sort of past that. In Arizona and large parts of the country, we have a lot of sort of NEPA cleared acres, and the real challenge is implementation. And so one of the ways that we're doing it in Arizona is solidifying those relationships via formal agreements to actually continue commitments on the ground. So if some of you heard the Undersecretary talk about the wildfire crisis strategy that's being implemented across the United States, that's a 10-year investment. That is a 10-year process. We're in year 2. And so one of the biggest things that I tell the folks that I talk with and the partners that I deal with, including the Forest Service, is that we need to stay committed to that 10-year effort. And again, we're only 2 years into it. My biggest fear is that we lose focus and we just sort of let it die on the vine, and we can't afford to do that. So one of the things we're doing in Arizona, we have new authorities to actually do work on the federal estate. Why are we doing work on the federal estate? Because like I showed in my slide, that's where the risk is. That risks around important communities and infrastructure. Think Flagstaff, Payson, some of the really Sedona, some of the really important communities in the state of Arizona. That's where our interests lie. And so one of the things we're doing is we're taking advantage of the Good Neighbor Authority in Arizona, and we have formal agreements with the U.S. Forest Service to right now treat about 70 to 80,000 acres over the next 10 years. We're also in negotiation to add another 90,000 acres for the state to help the Forest Service implement those projects. And so those are big commitments. And so that's one of the things that is important to me, is having real commitments by the parties who are involved. The other thing I'll mention, Jonathan mentioned that we have a Good Neighbor Authority with the tribal nations. We are also in negotiation, especially with the White Mountain Apache tribe, to expand our Good Neighbor Authority to collaborate with the White Mountain Apache tribe. So to me, it's all about implementation and setting in good management practices and formal agreements to stay committed to this work over the long term, which in reality, 10 years is not the long term. That's really the short term, because this work is going to take continued maintenance in order for it to be effective and truly reduce the fire risk across the Western United States and in Arizona.
John, do you have anything to add to that?
Could you share the question again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so we're talking about how states, localities, and tribes can effectively, meaningfully work together to mitigate, respond to, and recover from catastrophic wildfire. And then from you in particular, we're also wondering if you can expand on what engagement with tribes should look like in successful partnerships, what those have looked like and what you've seen in Arizona specifically.
Okay, what I'll refer, thank you for doing that. What I'll refer back to are those 4 legislative actions that I shared with you, starting with the Indian Self-Determination Act passed in 1975. That basically acknowledged tribal sovereignty and tribes' right to govern themselves. And since then, tribes have aggressively pursued through lobbying and whatever measures available to them to elevate their status within this wildfire community. In the past, a lot of tribal lands were managed by the BIA, and tribes, through the Indian Self-Determination Act, were able to assume management responsibility. And since 1975, you've seen that capacity and responsibility rise to the point where now tribes have, through the 2018 Farm Bill, have been elevated to the same level as states. Through, Good Neighbor Authority is now applies to states. And this has just gradually increased tribes' involvement as formal entities, as a tribal government, as a tribal program. And this allows them to pursue their own goals, their own tribal goals. And that's important to the identity of the communities, to the tribe, to the individuals that are involved. I myself am a product of this Indian Self-Determination Act. My first job was with a tribal program that had a self-determination contract with the BIA. And since then, I've seen this grow over time. And what I can say is that tribes are probably in the best position they have ever been in. Since the passage of the Indian Self-Determination Act, and the National Indian Forest Management, Tribal Forest Protection Act, Good Neighbor Authority. These are things that support all that and recognize the knowledge and skill of tribal practitioners in managing land. What has been missing is the funding to support that. And I do feel that the infrastructure bill is is a big step in doing that. It's being realized, I would say, on a weekly basis. I see that money having an effect on the ground, and it's all possible by this legislation that has put tribes in a much more favorable position.
Woody, do you have comments to add to that?
You bet. So being able to cross those boundaries and work with the tribes is very, very important. And it's needed. A lot of these landscapes, the way our boundaries go across them, you know, it isn't the boundary, it's the way the landscape lies. It's the way the watersheds lie and all that. I can tell you that as far as the tribes go and the dealings that I've had with them, they're spot on everything we've wanted to do and accomplish. The one issue that still faces us today, and especially when you're in that higher country in the pine trees, is when you cross that boundary line on our side, we can be litigated and shut down. And I've seen that happen. I was part of it on the Rodeo Chesky fire, and a good example of that was we had finally kind of put that one to bed, and they had the big helicopter crews from the Northwest down there logging the face of that rim, all old growth timber, and the tribes were pulling that timber off and getting that fuel loading out there that burned up. They're all burnt trees. When they came to us and asked if we would like for them just to move on across and then continue on, we obviously said, you bet, come on, let's get it all cleaned up. Let's get it cut down before it hits the ground and so forth. Before they could cross that boundary, we were litigated and shut down. And today those trees still lay there. And so that, I hope, is something that will, as time goes on and people become aware of that we can work through our differences on a lot of that and look at the projects and not just emotions. And worry about cleaning up a lot of that. As far as the tribes, like the San Carlos project down there is working with the Globe Ranger Station, the Tono National Forest. That's a really good project. Takes in a lot of country, and it'll be a very, very good deal when it's all said and done. But the one thing that still hovers over us today is just the fact that on this side of the boundaries, we do have that facing us, that litigation issue that people with a stroke of a pen can shut us down. And that's just something we have to work through. I feel like the more we get out, we speak to groups like you folks here, and we work through a lot of that. Maybe we can open some eyes and folks will realize, hey, this is for the better good of the landscape. So thank you.
Thank you. I want to transition to get some of this public health perspective in. We've all touched on the devastating effects that fire can cause during our opening remarks, but I want to talk about why the wildfire crisis is a public health crisis and how can upstream approaches like forest management help alleviate detrimental outcomes for health of communities and ecosystems alike. And I'll maybe start with Yulia and then I can tag it.
Great, thank you. So I think we had a great opening this morning because they did give us a lot of information on the devastating effects of wildfires. Just some more numbers. There is a 4 times increase in the burnt hectares since the year 85. And just to give you a perspective, last year there were 18 million hectares burned in Canada. This was a 6-fold increase over average, and it was experienced almost all over the United States. So, and I think this is one of those that we, talked earlier. We cannot talk anymore about wildfire season. Everyone is affected, even if there is no wildfire. There is like smoke. And for us in public health, this translates in increased levels in death rates, in cardiovascular diseases, lung diseases, increased burden for those who are pregnant, for children, for workers. And just to go back to throw numbers there, but the cost for dealing with wildfire suppression was $3 billion in 2019. So of course, like, the savings of life and the cost savings of being preventing and proactive are much bigger. But so.
Yeah, I'll just expand on maybe the second half of this question, which is how upstream approaches like forest management can alleviate some of these detrimental outcomes. And in the environmental health world, we think of this exposure continuum often where we have a source of a contaminant, it travels through our environment in some way, whether that be air, water, food, et cetera. You're exposed as your person, the contaminant gets into your body and then can wreak havoc. And we get to the toxicology side of things. And when we think about the best way to avoid these adverse health outcomes and reduce exposure, it's usually our like gold standard is to tackle the source itself. So when we think about traffic-related air pollution, we think about reducing tailpipe emissions. Like that makes sense to us. But in the case of wildfires in particular as these naturally occurring events, tackling the source itself seems kind of like an insurmountable task. And it's only really been in recent years that we've started to think about prescribed burning and forest management more broadly as a potential, exposure reduction strategy to tackle the source itself. And the use of prescribed burning obviously comes with its own smoke emissions that can contribute to adverse health impacts, of course. But fire is inevitable on this landscape, as is smoke, as many residents of the West here have probably experienced. And the thing about prescribed burning is that they are planned and often permitted events that we can, coordinate with public health agencies far in advance to increase that preparedness piece. And that can take place in days before a burn, weeks, or even on a seasonal scale. So I think there's some really great opportunities here for coordination at all levels of government with public health agencies, with forest management agencies to kind of target that preparedness piece in particular. And if we can, loop in public health practitioners into the early stage management practices, say burners are planning what their objectives are for a particular season, it would be great if we could start to, loop in your either county level health agency or your state Department of Health to, get them on the same page of like, we're targeting this specific region for fuel treatments this season. Based on, simple air quality models we can run, we know that specific communities may be particularly impacted. So you may want to target intervention resources to those particular communities. So that's just an example of how, some of this coordination can start to happen upstream. And we can start to think of prescribed burning more as an exposure reduction strategy. But I want to expand on this health piece briefly to kick it back to Yulia again, to think about this environmental justice component and which populations may be most vulnerable to wildfires and wildfire smoke, and think about how federal, state, local, and tribal governments can help protect these populations.
So it's, when I start telling you, you will realize it's almost everyone. But just age related, that children are at higher exposure just because they have smaller bodies and higher breeding rates. The elderly population and everyone with chronic conditions, especially those with heart disease, any type of heart disease. Actually, yesterday CDC had a presentation on increased ischemic heart disease during the Canadian wildfires. Of course, asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, immunocompromised, so the cancer, birth defects. So it's really the health evidence is staggering, and this plus lost lives. So we have a lot of populations that we need to protect. And when I introduced earlier our dashboard, where we have that information on for healthcare providers and the general population and the state health and local health departments, where they can look at zip code level at the wildfire smoke, but exposures, but they can also see the age group distribution, people with certain diseases, which can help plan, especially since, for these events, many of them are going to require access to prescribed medication when there will be no pharmacies or no access, or they will have to evacuate in shelters. We also know that low-income communities, they also, are not that well protected because they will not be able to close windows if they don't have air conditioning. There is a need to provide respirators, air cleaning, filtration, evacuation. So that's or a respirator. So there is a lot of need for planning for those communities too. And those who have repeated social and environmental stressors, so for the wildfire smoke, especially when we have air quality and heat stress, and with climate change, those have been intensified. So you have it prolonged, and so this is quite a stressor both on the physical and the mental health. And then with social stressors, so yesterday, the digital equity session was great because when we talk about communication and outreach, even with the alert systems, they happen oftentimes online. And we do a lot of research on outreach to communities, so we know that there is increasing number of them who will use, the phones on the internet, but then we still have a big number of the population that will not have access to those, that will rely on their community members, on word of mouth. So these are also things, that are incorporated on our dashboard where you can see the coverage and just for the local preparedness to be aware, even like the outreach during these events. And of course the workers, outdoor workers, utility workers, not, to mention the wildfires, the firefighters, and mental issues are, across the board for everyone. And especially as we're saying, like now it is almost everyone has experienced the wildfire smoke. So we know how it is, and the mental health burden from the climate change issues is increasingly being recognized, and like the number of people and the percentage of people who report depression and mental health issues because of climate change issues and wildfires is increasing. So was that all? Like, did I cover it all?
Yeah, I can just follow up on that briefly, on the outdoor worker piece in particular, and something that a few states across the West have been implementing, which is smoke rules for outdoor workers. So these are occupational regulations that started out as emergency rules in California, Oregon, and Washington, and have since been made permanent in all 3 states. And they're occupational regulations that require certain exposure reduction strategies to be implemented at various air quality index levels. So as Yulia mentioned, outdoor workers, and particularly outdoor agriculture workers, are disproportionately exposed during smoke events because of time spent outside during work shifts, increased respiratory rates because of the physical demand of their labor. So it's crucial that we're doing what we can and working with employers to get worker protections in place. And these are things like mask distribution, mask use requirement. They can be administrative controls, like shifting work schedules and providing access to clean air shelters and making sure that workers are using them. So that's something that I'm hoping in future years and seasons, other states across the West start to implement, because we have a fairly sizable agricultural worker population in all of our states. So yeah, you have additional comments?
Oh, I was wondering if they want to.
Do other panelists have additional comments on this?
It's an interesting question, and I would say in terms of health impacts on tribal communities, I think there's a big trade-off as to what are the benefits of prescribed fire. And in tribal communities, I think it's significant to note that federal funding that is applied to prescribed burning is to reduce the risk of wildland fire. It's not necessarily to support the propagation of culturally significant plants or protect culturally significant sites, although that may be integrated into any prescribed fire plans. So the trade-off is, what are the benefits that you derive as opposed to the impacts? And I think since most tribal communities are very rural, the community impacts as far as community health aren't that significant when you look at the benefits of prescribed fire. I think the public opinion of smoke is changing. I was walking around Flagstaff one day when there was a prescribed fire being conducted, just south of town, and no one seemed to be bothered by the smoke. I think that whole attitude of smoke has changed, and people are realizing the benefits of prescribed fire and how that is protecting their communities. And so they're more willing to accept the fact that you do have smoke. And as a ex-wildland firefighter, the smell of smoke, it's the smell of money to us. So.
Woody?
So there'll always be fires in Arizona. That's just a fact. And when you look at the rim country across there, that's one of the higher natural fire currents areas there are in the state. And so we're always going to deal with fires in Arizona. And with the Mogollon Rim running east and west like it does, everything comes off through our communities all the way down to here and further. And so I'm a huge proponent of prescribed fire. I'd rather burn a chunk of country the way that we want to burn it and see the outcomes that we want to see rather than wildfire. But wildfire will always be a part of Arizona. The other side of this, we focus on smoke and all that, and it's bad enough because in our rural communities, we have a lot of folks moving into there that they don't understand that. Some of them have health issues, and smoke gets in the air and they want us to turn it off. And so there's a lot of outreach, a lot of information that needs to be continually passed out there to folks and these homeowners. The other side of this is from a public crisis standpoint is when you burn a chunk of country under your own conditions, that means you can leave whatever fuels you want to on the ground, or you can take them however you want to do it. When a wildfire burns it, it has a good chance it's going to slick it off clean. And usually our fire seasons start now and run into July, August, but the monsoons are setting in, our summer rains are hitting. And from the standpoint in the seat I'm sitting in now, I've seen the other side of that on these wildfires. I've seen the floods. I've seen the water come down through these communities after these big burns a foot deep and just mucking people out. And so that's the other side of it. And I think that's a good message that needs to be pushed along. And I think in that message, under the prescribed fire scenario, we have the ability to determine our own outcomes on that. And I think the more people understand that, the more they'll be willing to work with us from the smoke management side of it. And hopefully we can continue those messages on. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to add something to this. I forgot to mention it, and we talked earlier about the wildland urban interface and the fact that we have a 45% increase of new housing since 1990 on that border. And that's like another complication added, that we have increased chance of wildfires, which we know, like entering the communities. And then, in addition to the lives that have been lost, we also have to consider all of these new chemicals that are added. And even after, weeks of chronic exposure to wildfire smoke, all of these chemicals will enter the water, the dust. So the exposure will continue, through the soil, through the ingestion, drinking. this is like, the part that this will increasing every year and repeated, which makes again the health effects go beyond the wildfire smoke. And I'm coming from Georgia, from Atlanta, and we have the prescribed fires, long history of prescribed fires and experience with them. At CDC, we have done a lot of risk health assessments together with our partners in EPA and the U.S. Forest Service and USDA, looking exactly of, the risk of wildfires versus, the smaller risk of prescribed fires, especially if they're done well, controlled, have a good outreach to the community, good preparedness, which will, the trade-off is saving so many lives and livelihoods and jobs and so on.
Looking at the clock, I want to make sure we get one or two audience questions if we have time, if there are any. It's not my best time management job.
You want this one? It's on.
Thank you. Thanks. Hi, my name is Joanna Struther, and I'm with the American Lung Association. And as we are coming into wildfire season, obviously, this is a very timely conversation. But also just today, the American Lung Association released our 25th annual State of the Air report, which looks at particle pollution and ozone. And in fact, in this year's report, we saw it reveals that spikes in deadly particle pollution are the worst that they've been in 25 years. And in fact, the top 25 most polluted cities for particle pollution are all on the West this year in our report, which we haven't seen in 25 years and 20 years. And so I really appreciate the conversations around partnership, because I think it's really important for state agencies and electeds to be partnering with local nonprofits. And of course, the vulnerable community that we support. And particle pollution can cause lung cancer as well. So I wanted to point that out. But I did want to talk about prescribed burning. I appreciate the conversation around prescribed burning, and the Lung Association does support prescribed burning. My question is around preparedness. Is there an alert system specifically around prescribed burning where we are alerting our communities, especially again, for those most vulnerable people who literally, we have people that live their life by the air quality index? What are ways we're making sure that they are prepared for those prescribed burns? Because we know it's important to prevent catastrophic wildfires, but their health is also important during that time.
Want me to start?
I'll go ahead and start. And I don't know about an early warning system, but I do know that smoke management is a part of a prescribed fire plan. And so the impacts of smoke to communities, how that smoke is going to respond to weather, changes in the weather, I think that's all incorporated into a prescribed fire plan. I'm not sure about the early warning part, but I mean, there are public notices that are saying, we are conducting this burn during these days. And if you are impacted, there are recommendations to stay indoors, things like that.
So this is my opinion. I don't think we do enough as far as pushing the prescribed fire part. We do a lot as far as wildfire and be prepared and do all that. I get it. We spend millions and millions and millions of dollars every year on suppressing these wildfires. I would really like to see a lot of that money diverted and changed and put into the prescribed fire part of it and work on the prevention side of it. But from what I see out there, we don't get in front enough as far as the prescribed part. We don't go into the neighborhoods that I've seen around here, our communities, and have those discussions until we're getting close to striking that match. And I think we can do better and be more proactive that way.
Just one quick thing on this. I think we can do better. Here's why. Last year in Arizona, I'll speak Arizona specific. Last year, there was 167,000 acres of prescribed fire put on the landscape. If you talk to the land management agencies, they're looking to maybe triple that, maybe quadruple that, because that's the scale of the problem that we're dealing with. One of the things I know that we do in Arizona is the ADEQ, Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, which has primacy for enforcing the Clean Air Act, shares information on their website. Each one of the individual land management agencies shares information about upcoming prescribed fires through their social media, news releases, et cetera. But it's part of that jurisdictional jigsaw puzzle. There more could be done to sort of holistically inform the public and especially those vulnerable communities about upcoming smoke. So that's on our mind, and it's a great question. Thank you.
I'll just follow that up and echo sentiments of my fellow panel members that I think we can do a much better job. And I think a lot of this needs to happen at the local level. I mean, just from my experience in Washington, talking to communities, it really seems to be the case that local management agencies and local public health districts or county level health districts don't know who their point of contact is. And we've run workshops to get those people in the room together to just figure out who you're supposed to shoot a text to if there's a burn happening in the next couple of days. And so I think there needs to be a lot more facilitation of getting those folks in the room together, because the coordination can certainly be improved, and it's something I'm hoping happens in the next few years. I've been told we can run a couple minutes over, so if there was one more question, maybe we can.
Karaoke. Yeah. Just talk loud.
Right, those of us in the electric utility business are very skittish about wildfire liability. We're investing a lot of federal and private dollars in vegetation management. We're starting to see this thrive. I live in Colorado, with current debate over preventative shutoffs of power on high-risk days, especially days, or shutting off power. Air conditioning, house machines, etc. And so for Yulia and Jonathan and Tom, it's basically a yes or no question. I'm curious how utilities are involved in outreach, planning, partners, stakeholders.
I'll start this one. So what you're saying is what I'm dealing with right now. It's called PSPS. And so we're faced with the same thing with APS here in the state. And what they're looking at is the vulnerability to some of those lines when the indices are really high. And the chance of a start is very high. A lot of it is due to winds and humidity, but they're looking at that. Now we're all coming to the table to discuss this. A lot of it has to do with lack of management around those lines. And I know that a lot of our utilities companies, they have a right of way, which I'm sure you do as well. And so what we're wanting to do there is expand that right of way and put more emphasis on thinning and vegetation management under those lines to alleviate that PSPS part of it. Because my argument is what they're trying to get away from, I understand. But the other side, the flip side of that is there's going to be a whole lot of people that's going to be put in a hurt real quick when they flip that switch. And you're looking at timeframes of like June is what you're really looking at. You know, high temperatures, low humidity, hot, miserable. We have lots and lots of people on different types of medical equipment, you know, that they need every day, oxygen machines, et cetera. And so for that switch to get flipped, I just can't help but think that other side of that's going to be far worse than that gamble for a start. But personally, I think that's where we all come around to sit around the table and discuss securing those lines a lot better than they are right now.
Yeah, just to add a couple of things. So PSPS means Public Safety Power Shutoff. The APS is put out some direction that they're going to start to doing that maybe as soon as this summer to alleviate ignition sources during sort of high wind, bad weather conditions. The other thing I'll mention, you asked a question about how integrated the utility companies are with our efforts around mitigation. They're hugely involved in the suppression of wildfires. When there's smoke in the air, the utility companies are at our side. They're integrated with our incident command system to understand the risk of the impacts to the transmission lines, especially. The transmission lines come largely from the north down to the metro areas, Phoenix, Tucson. The last thing we want is to turn off power during the middle of June. That's a significant health issue. The last thing I'll mention, since I have the mic, and I know we're running out of time, is, I'm glad you brought up suppression, or you alluded to it. Fires are going to burn, and that's the other side of the coin. We spent a lot of time this morning talking about wildfire mitigation. The other side of the coin is preparing for suppression, putting out the fires when smoke's in the air. One of the things that we're doing in coordination with the utility companies and other is using technology to identify when fires start. We're establishing cameras on transmission lines and transmission corridors, critical communication sites with the camera technology that uses AI. So when smoke pops up, the computers tell us, send a message to our dispatch center, and we have increased time to address those fires. So, the suppression part is a huge part of our work as well. We didn't get a chance to talk about that, but I'm glad you mentioned it, at least secondarily. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. I know we're very much over time. We could all talk about this for hours, but I want to just thank my fellow panelists and audience for their questions and their attention.